It's time to accelerate. Hi, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Join me as I host conversations with the leading experts in sales, marketing, sales automation, sales process, leadership, management, training, coaching, any resource that I believe to help you accelerate the growth of your sales, your business, and most importantly, you. Hello and welcome to Accelerate. This is another edition of Frontline Friday with my noted guest, Bridget Gleason. Bridget, how are you?
Andy, I am doing great. Good morning. Where in the world are you today?
Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? Actually,
that's right. Where are you today? Which coast are you on?
I am actually in San Diego.
San Diego, wonderful.
West Coast office for the next couple weeks. And it's a beautiful day. Yeah, a lot of San Diego weather's always perfect, blah, 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 blah. So
it sounds like, though, that you're going to be inside your studio for most of the day today. So
I am.
You may not be out. I don't want people to think that you're out there surfing, but you are inside.
Yeah, not surfing. Not surfing. I've surfed, but I'm not a habitual surfer. But it could be outside riding my bike or going for a long run. So
we probably shouldn't talk about that. I think that'll just make you feel badly.
Well, no, I
all these things you could be doing.
Yeah, well, it's the early day today. I had a great bicycle ride yesterday, and I'm due for a day off, actually. So
good. Well, it's coming up.
Need a recovery.
It's coming up. That's right. I get it.
So we're going to lead off with another question that was submitted, and this one, sort of an interesting question, a little more broad to some degree, but it speaks specifically to sales. And the question was, how do I become an expert? Right? This person's in a sales field and want to know, how do they increase their perceived level, or how they're perceived by the customers? How do they increase that level of expertise that's perceived by their customers, real or actual, I guess? And I thought, interesting question.
So that is an interesting question, and I misunderstood the question at first until you explained it, because there's a difference between how to become an expert and how can I be better perceived as an expert.
Okay.
Which are two different things.
Sure. So answer either one of those.
Well, it's interesting. We're doing some training for our SDR team, and we're using Winning by Design. Jaka, who's fantastic, just doing this very tactical training for them. And he was talking about this. How can you be perceived? You're an SDR. It's an entry-level role. How can you be perceived as an expert? How can you gain credibility? And it's interesting that you bring this up, because this is very fresh in my mind. Is he had said, he told them one phrase to use, which is when he's taking them through this sort of framework on asking questions and, finding out like two situation questions to get to the problem, to get to the value, blah, blah, blah. So when you identify when they've told you what the problem is, he said, he told the SDRs, the phrase that you say then is, yes, I hear that problem. You repeat the problem back a lot. I hear that a lot from other people who I talk to. And he said immediately, that simple phrase gives the other person the perception that, oh, you know something about broader field, just by one simple phrase. So that's one thing that just comes to mind as a more of a trick, maybe, in terms of perception.
Mm-hmm.
But I think to be perceived as an expert, it is important to do your homework, to have context, to be able to bring in and tie together things that you've heard from other prospects and customers that could be relevant. So to be able to provide something broader that you're being able to offer to that prospect or customer, that they see, it's like a teacher being one lesson ahead of the student. You need to be a step ahead. Typically, if they are talking to you, the salesperson, you are going to know a bit more about something. And that's what makes the conversation interesting, and why there would be an exchange of value.
Yeah.
What would you say? What would you say?
Why am I just sitting here? So exactly. Get off your butt and do something, Andy. So I think that one of the keys to being perceived an expert and becoming an expert is, and this is actually sort of going to play into the topic we talk about today, which is you have to be widely read about not just what you're selling, the product area that you're in, the services, the industry that you serve, but widely read in general. Because I think that to my experience, one of the ways that customers think that they're dealing with someone who is an expert, who is a step above, perhaps, is people that have a bigger, broader worldview. Because certainly the context of what you're helping create context for a decision somebody's going to make, and being able to bring in disparate information sources to help make the case other than just your standard ROI justification really makes the customer's eyes light up and say, this person gets it in a way that the other people I'm talking to don't. And so I think that this, stay current on current events, and not just current events relative to the news, but technology development, what's happening in science. Be curious, and that curiosity. If you have that curiosity, and it's reflected in just what you say to the prospect, their perception of you as an expert really starts to grow. And because I think people define expert as not just having deep knowledge, at least I do, is just not just deep knowledge in a single topic, but that, they have that, but it's supplemented by broader knowledge as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, as you've said, being an expert is not, sometimes being an expert, it is deep. And there are experts that have very, very deep knowledge, and there are experts that have very broad knowledge. And I think in sales, there's some level that you have to be deep in terms of the product and the market, et cetera. But I think having the broader sort of knowledge and awareness is also critical, because you're going to be dealing with a lot of customers in different industries and different situations, and they're going to have different backgrounds. And the broader your knowledge is, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to find common connections and places to interact with them on a different level that, as you say, just increase the perception that here's a person who's knowledgeable, who's interested, who's interesting, who's curious, and that maybe I can learn something from.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I've mentioned this before in the show, but I always harken back to this quote from Aldous Huxley, who was a famous British author, you should know something about everything and everything about something.
Love it.
And I think
that's a great quote.
And I think if you want to be perceived as an expert, that's where you want to be.
Yeah, that's a great quote. That's a great quote.
Words to live by.
Words to live by.
All right, so that ties to what we're going to talk about today, because we're going to talk again, another sort of edition of our Frontline Friday book club, and talk about books we've read recently that we found interesting, and in some cases might be a sales book, might not be a sales book. So you're a voracious reader. You just spent weeks on an airplane flying to and from Russia. What'd you read?
Well, when I was flying to and from Russia, I read Catherine the Great, which is a fascinating book. Perhaps not as many lessons and relevance for this group. I read a book called...
Could be some leadership lessons, perhaps.
She was fantastic.
I mean, she was one of the... Well, wasn't she made one of the first? Because Russia had been fairly patriarchal. Wasn't she one of the first female rulers?
She wasn't she wasn't the first. She came right after Elizabeth, but she was an early. There were not many of them.
Mm-hmm.
And what I love about those women is they were very astute and clever in orchestrating their rise to power. So it didn't just happen that she woke up and was the ruler of Russia one day, the empress. She did some organizing and orchestrating in the background to make sure that that was going to happen. So there was lots of
managing her own career.
She was brilliant at managing her own career. And talk about, Andy, someone who was curious and well-read. And that was actually one of her defining characteristics, is that she was extremely well-read and very interested in a lot of different things. That made her a very effective. It made her effective ruler. It made her an effective negotiator. It made her an effective collaborator. Just so that was really fascinating. The other one, I read a bunch of books. I read a book called Encore, which is about, where people are working longer. And so how do you think
longer into their lives?
Working longer, like they're not retiring as early. And how to
the chagrin of people that are younger than them, no doubt, right?
I know. Well, and so it was just interesting to think about how, in the spirit of managing your career for those listening that maybe are not early on in their career. Maybe they're later in their career and thinking about transitions. It's how to think about transitioning to maybe something new. Maybe you've been doing sales for 30 years and you think, okay, I want to work for another 10. What are some ways for me to transition into that? So that was an interesting read. And then a book was given to me by one of my sales reps that he really enjoyed, because we read here, and at Sumo Logic, everybody knows I'm an avid reader. We talk about books all the time. We've got a book library that we share. And so it's a big topic around here. And one that one of the reps gave me was The Last Season by Phil Jackson, an NBA coach. And again, I don't want anyone to think, again, I always say if my sons were listening, they would be laughing hysterically when I am talking about a professional basketball team.
Well, hey,
but there's some really
Bill Walsh's book is already on your list. We've spoken about that in the past.
We've talked about that one. There's several coaches.
You've got a thing for coaches.
I do. I think that
we'll have to explore that.
It's so relevant. It's so relevant to management and sales and winning and high-performing teams and teamwork and getting people to perform at their best and motivation. There's so much. I love reading. I love reading about them. A lot of it goes over my head, but those are three. But before I get into any more of those, what about you? I always love to hear what you're reading as well.
Well, let's see. I've sort of have to read sometimes for doing this podcast because I interview a lot of authors, and I can't read everyone's book, but I do read many of them. And one recently that was really interesting, I really enjoyed, was by David Brock, his new book called The Sales Manager Survival Guide. Actually, it's going to be the first of a series of books, I believe, from Dave. And it really breaks down, starts at basics about what it is sales managers do, right? It just starts right at the base level, make sure really understand, and what she says is, manager's job is getting work done through others. And that's the hardest thing especially for managers that have been promoted up through sales, is to learn. And then goes into a deep dive about difference between coaching and managing, and a lot of great section on coaching, which I think any sales managers out there or aspiring sales managers should pick up the book and read, because that section alone I think is worth the price of admission. And because, as we've talked about, and I've other interviews that I've done with people on the show, is we've talked about this, how coaching is, some of a lost art. and there's a lot of focus being paid to it, attention being paid on it now because it makes a difference, right? If it's done well, it makes a huge difference in terms of productivity and performance. So David just has a great section in there about how to coach. So I thought that was very interesting book. Another one I read, which I did an interview with the author, called The Machine. And the subtitle is A Radical Approach to the Design of the Sales Function by a gentleman named Justin Roff Marsh. And it's about sales process engineering. And it's sort of starts by debunking this idea of sort of what he calls sort of the myth of the heroic sales type. That salespeople think they're these autonomous free agents. And in his mind and based on his experience working with companies that he does, is that they're just I don't want to say this the wrong way, not just a cog, but there's part of the overall process of serving a customer's needs. And so he dives into a model that he advocates for very highly specialized, highly standardized roles for sales. And it's fascinating to read because it's perhaps a look at the future. As we spoke about in a previous episode, perhaps a look at the future, and as we become more data-driven and more specialized in the roles we undertake in selling.
Fascinating. I'm going to pick those up because I'm always looking for new ones to read and add to the bookshelf here.
Yeah, and I think that when you read The Machine is one of the thoughts that comes to mind because obviously you run a SaaS sales organization. We've a lot of focus on that, a lot of talk about that, certainly on this show and others. And this really says, well, that's sort of a good beginning, but it goes even further in terms of the specialization of roles and so on. And I think it's a good read for anybody who's interested in how sales can evolve and perhaps should evolve, and well worth checking out.
Is it positive? Like, is it a doom and gloom?
No.
Is he predicting, or is he saying?
This is what he implements. He's hired by companies to come in and re-engineer their sales process, and the end result is they tend to look a lot different than what they conventionally do.
And he's saying that by doing this, by this increased specialization, that the company benefits from better productivity, better performance, better results.
Better alignment of all departments in pursuit of a common goal.
Love it. I love it. The title of it, The Machine, I will say, for me, I don't want to say it's off-putting because I love the data part, and I love the data part. I love the optimization part. I love all of that, the alignment part. But when I think about the sales rep, the individual, the thought of the machine makes it sound almost like, this is going to be a really horrible role. I mean, that's why I wonder, does it just sound like, okay, here we've got, cog A, cog B, okay, you're cog C, and just keep cranking out, just keep working on this assembly line. That's why I'm curious.
It's actually, I think he would say, and you get a sense of this in reading the book, is that what it really does is put people in the roles that they're best suited for and give them really just the freedom to focus on doing what they are best at.
Okay.
Because it takes, it takes all the extraneous off their plate. And without getting into the details of how he engineers that,
What's the author's name?
Justin, and then the last name for people listening, that's hyphenated last name, Roff, R-O-F-F -Marsh, M-A-R-S-H.
Okay, good. I'm on it. Okay, sorry, keep going. I interrupted you.
No, that's so. Do you have another book?
Well, I I think talking a little bit about Phil Jackson's book and the last season, and it's interesting because when you were talking about David Brock's book, and you talked about one of the chapters in there, coaching versus managing, and going back to why I read all these books, and it's not necessarily intentionally, but about coaches, is because coaching is such an important aspect. And so looking at professional teams and and coaches who've really done it successfully, what are they doing there that we can apply to business? And a couple of things from Phil Jackson's book that I really appreciated. First of all, he had to manage some big egos there.
Yeah.
And
Shaq, Kobe.
Shaq at the same time, and their kind of fights with one another. And that's not unlike what you get on a sales team when you've got a lot of egos and you've got sort of people vying and wanting to be number one. And how do you do that? And how do you create a team as opposed to, like, he talked a lot in the book about having to balance working together as a team and not just wanting to feed the stars, feed the Shaqs, feed the Kobes. And part of what the franchise wants is the Shaq and the Kobes, they sell tickets, and people want to see them be, bigger than life. But they also want them to win. And it's just an interesting balance. I think, I think about that with relative to even Sumo Logic, when we've got different departments and we've got different teams, and how do we work together and yet independently for the greater good of Sumo Logic? How do we really play as a coordinated team? Right. So I found it really interesting and inspiring. And he talks a lot about, and again, interesting to get from a coach, but how really important, he calls it leading from the inside out, and that it's really leading with heart and his genuine interest and concern about players and the team and their best interests. And that's not something you can really fake.
No, and he's probably wishing he were back coaching after 2 years as president of the New York Knicks. So,
yeah,
though they've made some hopefully positive moves as a part-time New York resident, some interest in the Knicks, and hopefully they've made positive moves this summer. So, I was going to say just briefly, the last book I was going to talk about in the few minutes we have left is a new book by Barbara Weaver Smith. She had written Whale Hunting, about selling major accounts, and new book, Whale Hunting with Global Accounts, and subtitle 4 Critical Sales Strategies to Win Global Customers. Now, Whale Hunting was one of the seminal books in major account selling. Here she had some really interesting things to talk about. Just sort of, let's say, 4 critical sales strategies for capturing global accounts. But I thought had some interesting things for people, especially people involved with, again, a more complex sale, longer sales cycles. And because we have this obsession with sales process, I talk about sales process all the time as well. And it's important that be defined. But, she really injected some really interesting reality into the process. Because she talks about, she says, the longer the buying process, then the less obviously that the sales process can be defined by discrete steps, because at a certain point you might have a stage, but you don't know what the next step is, right, in advance. And so really it requires a different type of account planning to operate in that environment, which again, I think for people that sell complex accounts, it's a great perspective, something worth buying the book, reading. The other thing she talked about that I thought was really interesting for people in the complex sale, and it's that she says, as you get into a longer sales process, is that something has to sustain the prospect's interest. And she talks about the importance of creating this vision, which early on, as early as you can in the selling process, that that then becomes sort of the light they're continually attracted to as they move through the sales process. And failure to do that, has a price that they lose interest over a period of time, the momentum dies out, and so on. So two key things, sort of I took away that just the way she expressed it, I thought was great and a good book for people to jump into, especially as I said, if they've got a complex product they sell.
Well, Andy, thank you for providing me my reading list going forward. I'm going to have to get on a plane or something so that I've got a good long time to be able to read them. But I love that we share books. I mean, they're also everybody doesn't consume information in the same way. And I think sort of going back to the beginning of this session, it's however it is that you want to consume it, be it books, podcasts, videos. I know people through their Twitter feed, whatever it is. I think the real lesson or the point here is just to continue to be curious and increase your knowledge and, be looking at different ways to learn from different experts and people out there. There's just a tremendous amount of information and things we can learn from. It's, for me, if I had all the time in the world, I think I would just read all day. I love learning new things, and reading happens to be my preferred method of ingesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And just briefly, one closing plug is, as I mentioned before, is I also love reading poetry. And
yes.
And so I'm going to start recommending some poetry books for people to read. The first one here we'll talk about just briefly is it's called Passing Through. It's a collection of poems by a gentleman named Stanley Kunitz, Kunitz, who's passed away. But what's so inspirational, he was one of the great American poets. But this book was written when he was in his 80s. And it was a National Book Award winner. So for people thinking, gosh, and we sort of talked about this earlier with career, is that you talked the book Encore. Well, we've always had this vision that, we lose our creativity, our mojo as we get older. We've got to optimize that when we're in our 30s and 40s. And, reading this beautiful book of verse, is written by a gentleman in his 80s, early 90s. I think he lived to be 90, mid-90s. Just hugely inspirational because just the nimbleness of the mind and use of the words. And I think for salespeople, part of the importance of reading poetry is it gives you insights into better ways to express yourself that can get your point across, that help customers see more clearly what it is you're speaking about. And this is a great place for people to start if they're interested in sort of dipping their toe into the poetry pool.
I think that's another one I'm going to add on put on my list.
It's not available on Kindle, just FYI. So,
all right,
good
to know.
Have to lug it around with you, but it's a slim volume. So,
okay,
Bridget,
wonderful.
As always, great to speak with you and spend some time with you on Fridays.
Likewise. I look forward to the next one.
Yeah, and friends, thank you for spending your time with us. And as we mentioned earlier in the episode, have a question, please send it in, Andy@zerotimeselling.com. And I said we'll answer at least one question every episode. And thank you again for joining us, and talk to you next week. Wonderful. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to the show. If you like what you heard and want to make sure you don't miss any upcoming episodes, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher.com. For more information about today's guest, visit my website at andypaul.com.